That's a good question. I mean, there were some things that I anticipated being rough that weren't rough, and there's some things that I anticipated being easy that weren't easy. It, if you do your own exploration, you think like it's going to be difficult. Like for instance, I thought like it was going to be difficult to get like groceries and to buy things that we would need in our day to day life. Once I found out that there was a Costco in Songdo, um, I felt reassured that everything was going to be okay, and that I would at least have this one familiar thing. Um, and a lot of the stuff I read online was like, you're not going to be able to use your credit card everywhere, this and that. But it turned out that actually like getting what we needed and shopping, and it was easy. Um, and in fact, we went to like Costco like once or twice, and Costco was like, it wasn't important. In fact, Costco wound up being inconvenient and not particularly useful. Um, so I think really having an understanding of how you can get your needs met in a conversation, it's just a little bit, maybe the literature was a little bit outdated, times have changed. So maybe some of the point of sale stuff that used to not, where you couldn't use your credit card and things like that. Things have changed. Even like older people that I expected to not take our credit cards. There are people that seem to be like 90 years old with square swipes that we could use everywhere. So it was easy to get our needs met. So somebody who might be stalling because they want to get a little bit, want to deepen their understanding of like day-to-day cultural stuff wouldn't need to stall. You can just kind of go. In terms of like being better prepared, Korea requires a particular kind of ID to make a lot of stuff happen. The banking stuff is a little bit difficult. So if you really want to if you're going to spend like a big chunk of time there, a conversation clarifying things like how to get a bank account, how to catch a taxi, really having a deeper conversation about the cell phone situation. We wound up spending just a lot of money. I think we probably threw about $1,200 in the trash trying to survive for the first couple of weeks. Not having our phones the way they should be, making assumptions about Wi-Fi. So I don't know. I think maybe a day-to-day, just a more of a focus on the day-to-day rather than the big ticket stuff, can make for a smoother trip, eliminate some anxieties.
It might have helped had somebody done like a video introduction, to it and said, well, pay a lot of attention to pages 28 and 29, and 32 and 33. If they had something like that, that would have helped. To their credit, though, they had a virtual tour of the campus. So we could get a sense of what the apartments looked like, what the interior of the building, the Mason building on the campus, what that looked like. So yeah, I got a sense of it, but there's a big gulf between seeing something online, of course, and actually standing in front of the building.
Well, there's the survival practical stuff, of course, but what I found most helpful in my own study before I went to Korea was understanding the logic behind Korean culture. Things as simple as when you're on the bus, be prepared to push your way out because no one's going to get out of your way. But understanding that Korean culture developed in a rural community where everybody knew everybody and everyone was responsible to everyone. Move that into a big city, you can't do that. And so how the book I had read described that either you are a complete stranger and you don't really exist, or you are my long lost family member. Korean culture doesn't seem to have an in-between, which really suited my personality, which is why I stayed so long. But most Americans can't understand that. They don't see that. And so when they experience that in a Korean context, they get real confused, sometimes get offended. But if they understand where some of these behaviors that are so different from American behaviors are coming from, then it helps them to say, okay, it's not about me. It's not because I'm a foreigner. That taxi drove right past me, not because I'm a foreigner, but because of something else that's going on. And it helps to adjust to the differences more easily, just understanding where those differences are coming from.
To interact with. I would want to know what, something about, particular about the demographics, the kind of student that joins, for instance, Mason Korea. I would want to know what their high school experience was like, what their educational experience was like to date. I didn't know anything about what the Korean high school experience was like until I had arrived, and someone kind of told me after I started teaching, and wow, sounded intense, like nothing that I could have even imagined. So I'd love to know about the students' experience, what their experience was like with teachers in high school, what their teachers' different pedagogical approaches were like, whether or not teachers were kind of facilitative or lecture style, or just what the kind of educational culture is that the students were used to. So that would be good, knowing a little bit about the students' educational background, but also knowing about the higher education system in South Korea. So I would have loved to known about the Sky universities. I would love to have known about the kinds of standardized tests that the students take. And I'm still no expert at this by any means, but it's my understanding that students spend a lot of their high school time preparing for a very important test that kind of helps to determine which of these schools they get into, and you know, that test can kind of influence the trajectory of a person's life in a way that's not, I think, not quite the same as what I would think of when I think of SATs and things like that. You know, for instance, my brother went to a community college back in California, didn't do super well on the SATs, and then he transferred to a state college, and then he ended up at a really good college, and now he's a Silicon Valley executive from, you know, being a pizza delivery guy. So I would love to have learned more about the educational system, and then really, I kind of suppose I'd like to hear what students tend to do after college, or if there's information about what the students are intending to, the career paths that the students go into. I'd kind of like to know that. So I guess from a student perspective, I would love to know what the students' previous educational experience was like. I'd like to know a little bit about what the higher education system is like, and I'd like to know a little bit about what kind of career paths and kind of what the future holds for a lot of the students who are going the track that through, for instance, Mason Korea. I suppose staying with the students for a moment, and this is getting into kind of gray area, because I'm not sure how easy this would be to do, but I would love to know about what there is to say about some of the socialization habits of students, some of the points of conflict that might arise among students in terms of clique formation, in terms of, but not just in terms of that, but also in terms of like, what are some of the common things that are affecting mental health among that student population area. Well, this is interesting. This just came to mind, but I would love to have known more about the institution, for instance, the institution of Mason Korea. And I'd love to have known about that from a kind of big picture overview perspective, getting to know what departments were there. I didn't know, really. It's a small institution, one building, and not so big. I'd love to have an overview of the institution. I'd love to see, you know, like who's working there and whatnot, and just get an idea of the structure of the place. That's an overview. But I would also think that it would be very useful for a faculty member to get to know their department, or to get to know whatever section of the university they're going to be working in from a much closer perspective. So I think that the best way to do that is to probably, and this is what I did just because I didn't know what else to do, but I set up meetings with a lot of people who I was going to be working with in this, like I was working in the EAP program and also the English department. And so I set up meetings, and I got an opportunity before I arrived to get a pretty good idea of what it's like to teach there, and what the kind of institutional culture was like, what the norms were like, what the atmosphere was like, whether or not it was a really collaborative space or whether or not people tend to go their own way. So this kind of big picture and then deep dive into things like institutional culture, and even some background on strategy, like from, if you're talking to the dean or the provost, getting an idea of what are the institutional, I always call them shiny things, like what are the initiatives that the institution is really trying to further and trying to highlight as a point of, for instance, just as a point of attracting students to the institution. I'd want to know, like, what are the shiny things, and even a little bit about what are the areas of conflict, which there are inevitably going to be areas of conflict, and people don't like to talk about that very much, but I think it's useful to know, because if you have no idea what's going on and you walk right into something, it can cause problems.
That was an example of, when these orientations are really valuable, because oftentimes you're preparing for things that may happen, not things that will happen. And so to be prepared for the things that might happen, may happen, the potentials, at least to have them noted and acknowledged in advance is really important. And if you don't cover those things with faculty, they themselves might not even understand it as a conversation that they should have. Sadly, we've had faculty in the past who students have said, someone called me a name or said something really nasty to me, or women being harassed, whatever it might be. And the faculty member might say, well, I'm here for your academics. So if you've got those kind of issues, call somebody else or talk with your friends or whatever. And it's very dismissive. And, or even sometimes faculty members will say, well, you might not understand what's happening because it's a cultural issue, right? So in which case the student hears that their concern is not valid and it's just been negated. That's also very bad. So, but orientations for those kind of things, opening up that conversation has been incredibly important. So, so I've seen the evidence for myself anecdotally, haven't tracked it in a sort of systematic way, but certainly these kind of orientations are important for faculty.